God's social security plan. I'd like to begin by reminding us that when Israel came out of Egypt, their social security was greatly disrupted. Because in Egypt, they had homes, they had a means of getting their daily meals, they had a means of getting their clothes. It was all within a structure. And so socially, they had a level of security as much as they were slaves. And we know that slaves are pretty much guaranteed food, clothing, and shelter, because those who own the slaves want to protect their property so they can get the most out of them. If even for that reason, they make sure that they have food, clothing, and shelter for them. So when God took Israel out of Egypt, that whole social security system was disrupted. There was no guaranteed food, no guaranteed clothing, no guaranteed shelter anymore. And this meant that Israel would have to depend on an irregular, non-guaranteed system. And you know, this is the biggest fear for most of us as Christians today. We want to feel secure. We want to have the assurance that I'm going to get my money at the end of the week or at the end of the month. I'm going to be sure that I can go to the supermarket. I can buy food when I need food. I can buy my clothes if I need it. I'm not going to be out there in want. But Israel, I don't suppose they even thought about that when God was taking them out, or maybe they wouldn't have been so glad to jump out of Egypt and go out into the wilderness. But when reality struck them, when they realized that it wasn't so guaranteed that their 3 meals a day, nicely seasoned and well cooked, was no longer a surety, we know the story. They began to complain. But God put in place, first of all, a system whereby He would feed them daily. And we know that on 2 instances He made their water sure. One, when Moses spoke to the rock and water flowed forth, and then Moses got angry and he struck the rock and water still flowed forth, because God is faithful even when we are not. God is faithful even when we don't go with Him, because God wasn't even only thinking about Moses. God knew that Israel, His people, the couple million people, needed water. So God still provided water even when Moses didn't do what he should do. God is faithful, and so He was providing water. But God, we know the story. God provided bread every day. Every single day they had the guarantee of bread as long as they trusted God. And brothers and sisters, for you and I today, we need to get to the place where we know that our meals and our liquid is guaranteed by our Father God. It's guaranteed that you're not going to die of hunger or thirst as long as you trust in God. And of course, in today's, just to segue a little bit, today we're not even so concerned about the physical dying, but we're concerned about the spiritual dying. And as long as you trust God, you will not die spiritually, because the bread and water of the Spirit, the Word of God, the Spirit of God, the life of Jesus, is guaranteed as long as you surrender to Him. But God put something in place in Deuteronomy chapter 14. In verse 22, the instruction was to Israel, "Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year." And I'm going to summarize it. I don't want to read all the verses. It goes on to verse 29. You can read it when you have the time. But he says, okay, in verse 23, he says, you must eat this. So you're going to tithe. In other words, you're going to take 1/10 of everything that is produced, your production, what your field brings forth. You get 1/10 of it. And you're going to eat before God. in the place where God chooses to put his name there. In other words, you're going to go to church with it. You're going to go to the place of worship. You're going to go to that place where you congregate, and you're going to eat the tithe. And it says, whether it be the tithe of your corn, your wine, your oil, your herds, your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord thy God always. The reason for this first aspect of it is that you will learn to appreciate the fact that God has produced these things for you. God has made your field bring forth corn and wine and oil and the herds and the flocks. And therefore, while you are enjoying what your field has brought forth, you are recognizing that it is God who has multiplied it. You know, so many times when we do well, when we earn money, we feel that it is the fruit of my labor. I put in so much effort this month and I get a good commission, or I get a good salary, or whatever it is, because I'm a good worker, because I do well. Brothers and sisters, it is God who brings forth and reproduces everything that multiplies for you. And so he's saying here, when you get your tithe, when you get 1/10 of it and you're enjoying that, you will learn to fear God. You will learn to appreciate God for what he has done. The next verse says, if church is too far, if you couldn't reach that place, then he says you should sell the things, turn it into money. I'm just summarizing the verses, you can read them for yourself. And then you're going to buy, you sell the things, turn it into money, and then you buy something that you like, something really nice food, and you take it to the church, right? And you're going to eat that there before the Lord in the presence of God. Now look at verse 27 now. The Levite, that is the person who is dedicated to the service of God, you shall not forsake him. When you get your increase, when you get the production that God gives you, the increase that God has given you, don't forget that there is somebody who has dedicated his life to the service of God. And don't neglect him, because he does not have the forces of production. Remember that the Levites, when they came into Canaan, the Levites were not to get any property. Here is how it worked. When they came into Canaan, the land was divided up among 11 tribes out of the 12. The Levites would not have any part, any lot, nor inheritance. Therefore, God says, you tithe, you take 1/10. And that 1/10, you are going to, out of it, learn to appreciate God's blessing. But the Levite who doesn't have these elements of production must also be looked after from it. And then it goes on and it talks down in verse 29, it mentions other people who do not have inheritance in the land either. Verse 29 says, the stranger, somebody who is a stranger there among you, doesn't have any land. He can't do any farming. He can't produce. He doesn't have anything that can produce and give him an income. So he needs to be looked after. The fatherless, that's the orphans. The widow, somebody whose husband has died and she no longer, because in those days women couldn't work, women couldn't own land. And so once a woman's husband dies, she's left without anything to earn. So God is making sure that everybody in society is taken care of. What do I call it? God's social security plan. He says, when you tithe what God has blessed you with, something that's going to bless the stranger, is going to bless the orphans, is going to bless the widows, and is going to bless the person who has dedicated his life to God, to the service of God. It's God's social security plan that there'll be nobody going to bed hungry at night. There'll be nobody starving. There'll be nobody in want. And now look at it. 12 tribes. 11 tribes are to take 10%. Now if 11 tribes take 10% of what they earn, then you end up with 110%. Out of that 110%, the widows, the Levites, the orphans, and the strangers are well taken care of. But you know what happens? When God blesses people these days, and let us say God gives you $100, it's easy to take out $10 and give back, because $10 is not much money. But you see, when God gives you $100,000, it gets a little harder. Because $10,000 to take out and give to the service of God sounds like, that's a little bit much, isn't it? I'll just give $5,000. And what if God gives you $1 million? $100,000? No, man. I certainly can't give all of that. I don't think that's needed here. So I'm just going to give 10,000. And the selfish mind of humanity chips in when God blesses them more. And so it's one of the reasons why God has to hold back on the blessings for some of us. Because the more He blesses us, the meaner we get. The less willing we are to impart that blessing to others. And guess what? There are people around. There are widows. There are orphans. There are people doing God's service. There are strangers in need. They're hungry. But you stop at the stoplight and this little guy who is begging money, you take out $10 and give him. And you feel, oh, I did a good deed today. But guess what? How much did God give you? You know, not that you're going to give that person everything. But we have to consider. Now, that is all under the old covenant. But you understand the principle that God established there under the old covenant. God's heart has never changed. I want you to go with me to Malachi, which is a verse that we repeated very often. But I want you to put it in the context of what we're talking about now. Malachi chapter 3. And I'm going to go down to about verse 8. Verse 8 says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee?" How did we rob you, God? How can we rob God? And God says here, in tithes and offerings, "You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation." And then he says, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house." Why does God want meat to be in his house? God wants meat to be in his house, and meat here means food, so that his people, the strangers, the widows, the orphans, can be fed, and the Levites. And he says now here, Old Covenant, "that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." What is he saying? He's saying, if you are willing to care for the widows and the orphans and the strangers and the Levites, I am going to bless you more. I am going to give you more because you are willing to do with it what you're supposed to do. And let's just think of it. If you get $10,000 and you give 1,000, you're left with 9,000. If you get 100,000 and you give 10,000, you're left with 90,000. If you get $1 million and you give 100,000, you're left with $900,000. But although you have more left, you get meaner. You don't want to give the 100,000 because it's too much to give. But the 900,000 is not too much to keep. You see how Satan puts selfishness in our hearts when God blesses us? And so God has to hold back the blessing so we can get the little blessing. When he says, if you're faithful in the little things, I'll make you ruler over many. It's the same concept he's talking about here. So, again, Old Covenant, but the principles don't change. And I'm going to go to the New Covenant now. But I just want you to understand the principles here of why God wants us to give, be generous to those in need. That's what I want you to go at. Now, I want you to go with me to Hebrews chapter 7. I'm going to read first verse 5. Verse 5 says, "Verily, they that are of the sons of Levi who receive the office of the priesthood have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. That is, to take tithes of their brethren, although they all come out of the lines of Abraham. They're of the same household, the same generation, but yet the Levites have a commandment to take tithes from the rest of their brethren. So that was the system that we just looked at in the Old Covenant. It was established by God. The Levites had that commandment to receive those tithes. It was there very clear that that was a part of it. Verse 6 down to verse 10 talk about the fact that the priesthood has changed and it's a different system now. But verse 11 says, if therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people receive the law, but if perfection were by that priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? So the writer here is making a point that old priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, did not bring perfection. It could not bring perfection, because if it did, you wouldn't need that another priest should arise. And this other priest who is arising is after the order of Melchizedek. And he's not after the order of Aaron. In other words, he's no longer the Levitical system. Verse 12 now says, the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. So the priesthood is changed. It's no longer the Levitical priesthood. Therefore, the law relating to the tithing system also changes, because it's a different system. Now, I did point out that there were 11 tribes giving tithes to one tribe. And therefore, it would guarantee that that one tribe would be at least on an equal standing with the others. And enough would be there for the strangers and the widows and the orphans. So when 11 tribes give 10% each, you get 110%. So the Levites would also get equivalent to the rest of the tribes, and so there would be enough for the widows, orphans, and so on. It was a system that God established, a social security system, to be sure that his people would be taken care of. But the priesthood has changed. We no longer have 12 tribes. We no longer have 11 plus 1. And Jesus is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so the system is different now. Peter says, we are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. The priesthood is now different. It's no longer, as I said, 11 tribes providing for one tribe. It's now God's people, anywhere they are, everywhere they are, looking after those of the household of faith who need to be looked after, who do not have the means, who do not have the inheritance. So the poor you will have always with you. They are our responsibility in the household of faith. The people who do God's service, the Levites of today, you have with you. And they are supposed, let me tell you something. A lot of pastors nowadays have house and land and farm and bus and truck and all kinds of things where they're busy investing money in things to earn their way. I don't think that's who God is talking about. But where there are people who dedicate themselves to the service of God, then the household of faith has a responsibility to ensure that these people are well provided for as well. Now, perhaps if people were doing what they should be doing in taking care of the pastors, they wouldn't be investing so much in other things as well. Maybe they wouldn't have to do other things. So it's both sides, both ways. It's the responsibility of the people to ensure that their pastor, their spiritual leader, their Levite, does not need to go do other things to make a living for himself. And therefore, he or she can dedicate their lives to the service of God. That's important. But when you, so we as a people, that when God blesses us, whatever the resources are that God has given us, we have a responsibility from those resources to look after the strangers, the widows, the orphans, and the Levites among us. We have that responsibility. And this is what God intends. So no longer 11 to 1, but whatever the proportion is, it doesn't matter. If it requires 10%, you give the 10% for the service of God. If there are 5 people looking after one, then clearly you need more than 10%. Because you want 20%. Because you want that everybody to be taken care of. Now here's what Jesus says about it. Matthew chapter 25, pick up at verse 41. Then shall, and we know of this. This is depicting the end of time when you have the sheep and the goat. And Jesus says now, he spoke to those who were the sheep, and he says, come, you did all this for me. Then he shall say to those on the left hand, depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick, and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they answer him, saying, Lord, when did all this happen? Because we can't recall not doing that. We never saw you. We never neglected you. I mean, you might say, I was in church every week. I did all the things that church said I should do. So I can't recall doing that. And Jesus will answer them, saying, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. Inasmuch as you did it not to the stranger, inasmuch as you did it not to the widows, inasmuch as you did it not to the orphans, inasmuch as you did it not to the Levite, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. It is similar to what Malachi says, you have robbed me. But Jesus is now contextualizing it, and he's putting it practically before you as to how you can rob God. You can rob God by not looking after these people. Now Malachi, the one we read in Malachi, ended on the positive note, and I want to end this on a positive note, because when he spoke to those on the right, they said, Lord, when did we do this? When did we see you sick or in prison and come unto you? And the king shall answer and say unto them, truly I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. Malachi says, I will open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing. Jesus says, verse 34, then shall he say unto them on the right hand, come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. If you do this, if you care about people, and this is not something that is strange to us, we know it. When you pour out the bowls of compassion to people, to the fatherless, to the widows, to the orphans, to the strangers, and to those who dedicate their life to the service of the Lord, when you do that and ensure that they are taken care of, God says to you, come, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I will open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Brothers and sisters, we don't follow the old system of tithing. We don't believe that anybody should compel anybody to take out 10% and to drop it into your church or in your offering plate. I don't believe so. I believe that when you become a part of the royal priesthood, when you are a child of God, it's not 10%, of what you have that is dedicated to God anymore. It is 100% of what you have that is now committed to the service of God. So when people are hungry, you don't check out 10% to feed them. You feed them. When people are in need, whether they be orphans or widows or strangers or Levites, when they have needs, you don't take out 10% to give to them. You find the need and you supply as best you can. You might not be able to supply all a person's need, of course, but you unite with others, and when you combine your efforts, when 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 or 20 or 40 people combine their efforts because their hearts are the hearts of God filled with love and compassion, then sometimes it's only 2% you need to use because it's being taken care of. So it's not 10% nor 100%, it's what the need demands. And if you're the only person there and the need demands 100%, you give your 100%. Why? Because you know tomorrow God is going to drop manna on the ground for you again. You are going to be blessed. He says, I will open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing. So don't be afraid to bless others with what you have, because God is going to give you more. That's His word, and He does not lie. He cannot lie. He has committed to that. And prove Him. I put it to us, brothers and sisters. Prove Him. Don't measure your 10%. Give your all to Jesus, and He will give you heaven's storehouse. May God bless us.